Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Bishop, for having me here. I want to thank Thomas Susky Photographers, because my computer has been on the fritz and they lent me their computer for today. So I really appreciate that. Welcome everyone joining us. It's in Woodruff, is that right, Steve?
Yes.
Okay, welcome you guys joining us. So glad you're here. Just a little background about myself. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. So I was told last night most people here aren't Vikings fans, so that won't be held against me. Grew up outside of Philadelphia, went to Catholic school, went to Mass my whole life, but on Sunday, but I really wasn't involved in the parish growing up. When I graduated from high school, went to Loyola University in Baltimore. I just lost in lacrosse yesterday, but anyway, went to Loyola. I was a writing and political science major, had absolutely no interest in working for the church whatsoever. When I graduated from Loyola, I wanted to get involved in politics. Thought about working for a pro-life congressman on Capitol Hill, maybe running for office one day myself. That was sort of my dream and my vision for my life. And then I spent some time in Washington, D.C. And so after about 6 months in Washington, D.C., I just decided the ethos of the town, it was not for me, that this was not really what I wanted. So I didn't know what I wanted with my career. At the same time, I was getting very serious about my girlfriend at the time, now my wife Mia, getting ready to propose to her. And so all of this was going on in my life. So I thought about going back to school full time to get a political philosophy degree. So that was kind of in my mind, and all this was going on. A professor from Loyola called me to ask me if I'd be interested in a career change. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, yeah, I would. I'm trying to figure out my life. And she said, well, I'd like to introduce you to Father Michael White. He's the pastor at Nativity in Timonium. They're looking for a youth minister. Would you talk to him? So interviewed with Father Michael a few times. Eventually he offered me the position to do youth ministry at Nativity. And so I had this offer on the table. So I thought, what should I do? Should I go back to school full time? Should I take this position at Nativity doing youth ministry? I know I want to get married. What should I do? And I was just discerning my decision. I thought, you know what? If I'm going to get married, I probably should have a paycheck. So I like to say that I got into ministry for the money. And obviously you don't stay in ministry for the money, or if you do, you're not very smart. There's lots of ways to make more money. But I thought I would be in the parish for 2 or 3 years and move on to something better. And that was 21 years ago, because I found there's really nothing better than working in the parish. There's nothing as important as working in the parish, working in the church. We have the most important work there is. So I still, again, serve at Nativity, which is in Timonium, right outside Baltimore. I've held many different positions from, again, starting out in youth ministry, doing small groups, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, running our children's ministry, to raising money for doing strategic planning, raising money for a building that we built, a brand new sanctuary built and finished, that was completed in fall of 2017, raised money for that. So I've gotten to see all these different aspects of parish life. And so that's what I bring to you today. That's all my experience is. It's from our specific parish. What we like to say is this, that we are the world-class experts on evangelization and discipleship in May of 2019 in a place called Timonium, Maryland. That what we know is what we've experienced in our parish. We really believe there's transferable principles that you can use in your parish, but we leave that to your application. So you're smart enough to figure that out. But we do think there are transferable principles, no matter what kind of parish you have. Probably most of you are here in a more rural parish than we are, but rural, suburban, urban, we think our principles can transfer to you, but we leave that application to you. Another thing we'd like just to say is, again, we don't know everything about running a parish, or I don't know everything about running a parish. Nobody knows everything about how to run a parish. There's too much to know. What my job is today is to take what's in my cup, the experience I've had over the last 20-so years, and pour into your cup. And so that's all I hope to do today. So to begin with this morning, just want to ask you this question. Have you ever wondered, why am I here? Hopefully you don't ask that question right now. You're not already saying, why am I here? Why did I come to this? Why did I get up early this morning? You know, and sometimes we can find ourselves in those situations where we ask, why am I here? Or why am I doing this? And sometimes it's in smaller events, like maybe you go, if you're like me, I'm an introvert actually, so if I go to a party and I don't know anybody, I'm like, why did I decide to come to this? Sometimes it can happen in school. It happens in school a lot, where you're taking a class. You think, why do I have to take this class? I will never need this information. You know, and in the busyness of life, the why question doesn't often get asked enough. You know, and for small things it doesn't matter, but in the busyness of life, on the big issues, it does matter. It does matter when it comes to our work, our career, our marriage, our family. So in the busyness of life, the why question often does not get asked soon enough or often enough. And so what I would ask you is why does the church exist? How would you answer that question? Why does the church exist? See, when we first came to the parish, which was Father Michael, who was a co-author of the book, still pastor at Nativity, he came in, I came into the parish. We thought essentially, if we thought about it at all, that our job was to provide programs for church people. So for Father Michael, that meant running bus trips and coffee after daily Mass and having lectures. For me, doing youth ministry, that meant doing as much as I could possibly think of, doing ski trips and lock-ins and crab feasts. I mean, in Baltimore, you have crab feasts. You know, doing anything I could possibly think of, mostly just to get kids to show up to church. And so for a while, we set about providing all these programs and events just to try to get people engaged in the parish. And as we did all these programs and did all these events, it led to burnout. And the burnout was because nothing was ever different after than before. And nothing seemed to change in the people in the pews. Nothing seemed to change about the parish or change about the people. And yet we were doing and running all these events. It was kind of reminiscent of that story, Alice's Through the Looking Glass. At a certain point, the Queen says to Alice, she says, "Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get anywhere, you'll have to run at least twice as fast as that." I mean, ever been there? Right, where you're running as fast as you can just to stand still or even to catch up. That's the way we felt. And we were getting more and more burnt out. And for Father Michael and I, we each had kind of different moments in which we realized that we were running this race at this rapid pace, but really going nowhere. For me, we kind of both had our aha moments. For me, the aha moment was I read a book by a pastor, a youth pastor, who wrote a book called Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry. And I read the book Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry, and as I read through it, I thought, this is my problem. I have no purpose to my ministry. I'm doing lots of stuff, but what is my purpose? Why am I doing it? I don't know. For Father Michael, he recounts his story, and it's in our book Rebuilt, where we had these events called Family-Friendly Fridays. And what we would do, these took place during Lent. And what we would do is we would pile during Lent these Friday events on top of everything else we were doing. And they were six events that we'd have the Fridays during Lent. And we called them Family-Friendly Fridays, but they really weren't that friendly. At least for us as a staff, which was pretty much Father Michael and I and a few other people. Because at the Family-Friendly Fridays, what we would do is we'd have a speaker, we'd have Mass and Stations of the Cross, but the feature was dinner, which we provided free of charge in the hopes that people would show up. And they did. And over the course of a few years, that program grew to about 500 or 600 people coming on a Friday night. But they really weren't accomplishing anything. And so in the book, and Father Michael tells this story a lot better than me, but at a certain point, Father Michael was there, and he was serving the food, and a woman came up to complain about the food, the free food. And so for him, something snapped, If he was here, he'd say an artery exploded. He's kind of dramatic. He's a little dramatic. So anyway, and in an instant, he realized that he had to change, that things at the parish had to change. He didn't know why he was doing what he was doing. When we lose our why, we lose our way. When you lose your why, you lose your way. So why does the church exist? Well, to come back to that, we return to our Savior, to what Jesus said is our why. Jesus gives us our why. And he gives it throughout the scriptures, I think, in many different ways, many different times. But I think most clearly he gives it to us in Matthew chapter 28. Matthew 28 is the final chapter of Matthew's gospel. It begins with the empty tomb narratives, and it ends with Jesus' ascension into heaven. So we're coming upon that soon. And so it ends with Jesus' ascension into heaven. And so Jesus gathers the 11 remaining loyal apostles and says this: all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now that sentence right there is packed with meaning. To truly understand it, we need to go back all the way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis. And when God creates the earth, he says to our first parents, I am creating the earth and I give you authority over the earth. But we know what happens pretty soon thereafter. Our first parents, they eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And when they eat that fruit, they surrender the authority God had given to them over the earth to the evil one. And so the story of the Old Testament is a story of God preparing to send his son into the world so he can win back the authority our first parents surrendered. So then in the fullness of time, Jesus, the Son of God, comes to earth. He lives in obscurity for 30 years in a backwater town of Nazareth. And then at the appropriate time, he launches into his ministry. He preaches and he teaches for 3 years. Then he goes to the cross. He's beaten, bloodied, nailed to the cross, all to win back the authority that our first parents surrendered. And now before he ascends into heaven, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He says to the apostles, okay guys, I am now passing on this authority to you. I'm giving you this authority. Now here's what I want you to do with this. I want you to go and, now you probably know what it says. But think about what it does not say. Jesus does not say, I want you to go and play bingo. I want you to go and run potluck suppers. I want you to go and run middle school lock-ins. Thank you, Jesus, as a former youth minister, I don't have to run middle school lock-ins, right? Jesus says, and I heard someone say it, go and make disciples of all nations. That's it. Go and make disciples. And make disciples, he says, of all nations. So in case the apostles thought, okay, Jesus, we got our quota? When are we done? When can we stop? Jesus says, you can stop when every single person is a disciple or a follower of me. Now that's the mission of the universal church, to make disciples of all nations. But if you're like me and you work in a parish, that means our job is to make disciples of the people in our parish. And a parish is a geographical area. It means we're not just supposed to make disciples of the people already in our pews, but everyone that lives in the boundaries of our parish, not just the people in our church. We're responsible for making disciples of everyone in our community. As one pastor likes to put it, he says this: your zip code or zip code is your mission field. Now, what is a disciple? What does it mean we're supposed to make disciples? Well, we could stay here all day long and talk about what makes somebody a disciple. We like to say this: a disciple is someone who's growing. I think that's a key word. First of all, let's say this: disciples are students. They are students who are learning to follow the master. You can still have a lot of bad habits and be a disciple. But a disciple is someone who's growing to be a little bit more like Jesus today than they were yesterday. And by God's grace and by the power of the Holy Spirit, will be a little bit more like Jesus tomorrow than they are today. We say this: a disciple is someone who's growing, and that's a key word, to love God, love others, and make disciples. So, disciple is growing to love God. That's pretty obvious enough. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And that begins by going and worshiping God at Mass. It continues with private disciplines like prayer and fasting and giving. It means developing a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Jesus says in John 10, we heard a couple weeks ago, my sheep know my voice. They hear my voice, and they will not follow the voice of another. Loving God means offering our lives as a living sacrifice, as Paul talks about in Romans 12. Offering our financial life, our family life, our recreational life, our work life, every aspect of our lives back to God. So disciples are growing to love God. Disciples are growing to love God, but when Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He really didn't give just one answer, did he? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says if we're not loving, in John, if we're not loving the person we can see, how can we say we're not loving God who we can't see? And the Pharisees, they were really great at trying to observe God's laws, but they were not good at loving people. And so Jesus had his harshest criticism for them. So loving others means serving others, being in fellowship with other believers, accepting others, encouraging others, being kind to one another. Although throughout the writings of Paul, we see all those one another's that show what love of others is about. And Jesus says we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus seems to indicate that our ability to love other people depends upon our ability to love and care for ourselves and practice self-care. So disciples are growing to love God, love others, and make disciples. That's the third one. And we see this happen all the time in the scriptures. When Jesus called the first apostles, he said, follow me and I will make you something. But Jesus didn't say to the apostles, follow me and I'll make you stronger. Follow me and I'll make you smarter. Follow me and I'll make you richer. Not follow me and I'll make you better looking. Right? Jesus said, follow me. Jesus didn't even say, follow me and I'll make you holier. He said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. In other words, Jesus says, if we follow him long enough, we will learn how to bring other people into a relationship with him. We will learn how to include others in a relationship with him. And we see this happen often throughout the scriptures. A couple of stories just to remind you. Think about the Gerasene demoniac. Mark tells us at a certain point, Jesus gets in a boat to travel across the Sea of Galilee. And there's this huge storm. He's asleep in the boat. The apostles think they're going to die. They wake him up. Jesus calms the storm. He says, where's your faith? They get to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a man possessed by a legion of demons. And Jesus gets out of the boat, drives out the demons into that swineherd. They run off the cliff, and then Jesus gets right back in the boat. He has seemingly come all this way for one guy, gone through a whole storm for one guy. And as Jesus goes to get back in the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons, he tries to get in the boat with Jesus, and Jesus says to him, no. You go back and you tell people what God has done for you. And apparently he did. Because the next time Jesus comes there, the same crowds of people who had begged him to leave the first time because they were just weirded out by his power and what he was doing. This next time Jesus comes back, they are begging. They are coming to Jesus to hear him teach and begging to be healed. All because one guy shared what God had done for him. Think about the disciples make disciples. They bring other people in a relationship with Jesus. Think about the woman at the well. Here's a woman that goes to the well at the hottest part of the day. Why does she do that? Because when everybody else would get up early in the morning when it was cooler, because she's got a past and she doesn't want to see anyone. But on one day, John tells us, the Gospel of John tells us that she meets Jesus. And there she sees a man who loves her and accepts her. And after meeting Jesus, she runs back into the town, back to the very people she did everything possible to avoid. And she says, come and see a man who knows everything about me. Is it possible he's the Messiah? Disciples love God, love others, and make disciples. So at a certain point in our story, after probably about 4 to 5 years of leading our parish, we recognized that's what we weren't doing that. We weren't making disciples. And even if we were getting people to come to programs, we weren't succeeding as Jesus called us to succeed. We weren't helping people to grow, to love God, love others, and make disciples. And so our story began to change when we humbled ourselves, just a little bit, but humbled ourselves to go and learn from growing churches. We humbled ourselves to go and learn from growing churches, even if that meant turning to Protestants. And so, at a certain point, I kind of mentioned, I had read Doug Field's book, Purpose Driven Church. He was the youth pastor at a place called Saddleback Church out in Orange County, California. And so, at a certain point, I got an email about a conference they were running. And so I emailed Father Michael and said, hey, do you want to go out to this conference and check it out? And he did. And so Father Michael and I, with one other person, we went out to California, and there we stepped on to Saddleback's campus. Saddleback is Rick Warren's church, if you've heard of him, he wrote Purpose Driven Light. And so stepping on Saddleback was like stepping onto a different planet. I had never been, I think I maybe had been to one wedding in a non-Catholic church, but that was it. I'd never been at another Protestant church, and certainly not on a kind of evangelical mega church. At one point we drove up, and there was a building we thought was the church building, which turned out to be the children's building. So a whole building designed and for the children, younger children in grade school and younger. So we went into that building, and then we went into the main church, which was not like anything else we'd ever experienced as Catholics. You know, for us, big churches meant expensive churches, ornate churches, but this was a big church that was kind of like a Walmart with chairs. You know, very plain, very simple. And as amazing as the campus was at Saddleback, what really caught our attention was not so much, again, the campus and how nice it was, but the people. The people were so much different from the people at our church. They were so nice. They were so nice, and they were so kind, and they were so happy to see us. In fact, they were so happy to see us at one point we went into a door, and we were so warmly welcomed. We went out a side door and came back in to see if it would happen again. And it did. And so we began to wonder, what is going on here? What is different about the people of Saddleback that's not true about the people in our church? And so we continued that journey to learn from growing megachurches. And we went out to Saddleback Church in California, Willow Creek, Chicago, a little closer to here, North Point in Atlanta, to name a few. And we kept going to those experiences, and we learned a great many lessons. And there's 3 key things we shared that we brought back to our church, and I'm going to share those in a moment. But some of the other lessons were just, first of all, that we realized that growth is always outside our comfort zone. You know, we put ourselves in those environments, and we were not comfortable. Again, we were Catholics who were, we were afraid we were going to be outed as Catholics in the evangelical setting. We were not comfortable there. It was not the experience of church we had had before. But because it was outside our comfort zone, It forced us to grow. Growth will always be outside your comfort zone. It's not a fun fact, but it's the truth. Another thing we learned is that because we were growing as leaders, the church, the parish was growing. And a growing parish is going to have growing leaders. So those are some of the lessons we learned. And again, a ton of other lessons we picked up. But there's three kind of key strategies that we say have driven the transformation of our church. And one of the things I did not mention in the beginning, I like just to point out the growth in our church. And the growth in our church is not because we're so great, it's because God has blessed certain strategies. But so we built a brand new church. We had to because our weekend attendance has tripled. That we have probably about 3 to 4 times the number of volunteers in the parish when we first took over. Our budget has quadrupled over that time. All right, so these things do work. And so what we would say is there's 3 key strategies we said that drove our transformation. And before I just one more thing before I get there, I want to share with you a quote from the book Switch, and it says this. This is a great book called How to Change When Change is Hard. Chip and Dan Heath, who wrote the book, wrote this. In studying, they said there's a clear asymmetry between the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution. Big problem, small solution. Big problems are rarely solved with commensurately big solutions. So all of us are here because we see a big problem in the world. And the big problem, I don't know how you would articulate it, but it's somewhere probably along these lines. The big problem we see is, and Steve talked about it, declining church attendance, declining church engagement. We see the kind of big problem, the loss of the church as a key influencer on culture. And we see that as the church loses its influence on culture, that the culture continues to slide downward. And that concerns us. And every one of us is here because we are concerned about the loss of the influence of the church in our larger culture, because we know the culture needs the influence of the church, and people really do need a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's a big, huge problem we're all trying to solve. And what our minds tend to do, what Chip and Dan Heath, they call it direct the rider, and the rider they mean is your mind. What our minds tend to do is, because there's a big, huge problem, we look for big solutions. And what Chip and Dan Heath argue in Switch, and what I would agree with, is that the solution to big problems, big problems are not solved by big solutions. They are solved by small solutions implemented over time. As they go on to say, big problems are rarely solved with commensurately big solutions. Instead, they are most often solved by a sequence of small solutions. A sequence of small solutions. Take step after step after step after step. A sequence of small solutions, sometimes over weeks, and sometimes over decades. I like to talk about long obedience in the same direction. So, what are the 3 things we found? Nothing really amazing here. We found, first of all, that churches that were growing and healthy, that if we wanted to do that, we had to change our focus from church people to unchurched people. That these growing churches had a clear understanding of the people in their pews who were not going to church. They understood the people that were in their community who were not coming to church. And they focused their attention not on the people already there, but on the people not there. Second, we realized we needed to prioritize the weekend experience. We meant the weekend mass and the programs around it. The growing healthy churches had created an experience and moments in their weekend worship that drew people in. And so by this we mean our weekend mass and programs that surround it. In our book, we say it's about the weekend stupid, which is a paraphrase of James Carville's axiom of the 1992 election. It's about the economy stupid. And no matter what you think about that phrase or about who won the election, you have to admit it's pretty sticky. And we say it's about the weekend stupid because we were the stupid. It took us so long to figure this out. And then the third thing we said is this, that we need to challenge people to take responsibility for their faith and the mission of the church. Another way I say this is we have to shape a clear discipleship path. So what do I mean by that? When it's challenging people to take responsibility for their faith, is that so often in our parishes, the people in the pews think that the staff or the priest is supposed to, spoon feed them faith. But really, people to grow and mature in their faith and their relationship with Christ, they need to take responsibility for that. There's certain habits, certain disciplines, certain environments they need to put themselves in so they can grow. Now, our job is to help provide those environments, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we can't make people grow, and we can't spoon feed people. For people to, to grow to maturity, they need to own it. And second of all, they need to take responsibility for the mission of the church. They need to see that the mission to go and make disciples, again, it's not for missionaries out in foreign lands. It's not for the priests. It's not just for the paid staff. To go and make disciples, that's a mission that every single one of us, as a follower of Christ, needs to own. So we're going to dive in to these three, for the morning, we're going to look at these three, morning and then early afternoon, these three different strategies. So the first one is this. Focus on unchurched people. Now, this just kind of makes sense because this is our, excuse the word, but it's our growth market. If we're going to grow as parishes, we can grow deeper and we can grow wider. Deeper is growing deeper in faith, but wider means reaching new people. Right? We can't grow as a parish if we don't reach people we aren't currently reaching. Or think about it from a business perspective. If you're a business and you want to grow your business and make more money, what do you have to do? Well, you need to get people to buy more stuff from you, but you also want to get brand new customers. And as a business, you can steal somebody else's customers, right? It's no big deal. If you're, 3M, I don't know who's 3M's competitor, even though I shouldn't, maybe you don't want me to know who that is, but Medtronics, all right? So 3M wants to grow, they can steal some Medtronics customers. But as a church, we're not trying to steal customers. We're not trying to steal other people's fish. If there's people following Christ in another church, we don't want to steal them. We have to reach the people we're not currently reaching. So if we're going to grow, we got to reach those people. And so the way that helps us stay focused on this is that we've created this mythical figure, and if you've read Rebuilt, you know about it. We call Timonium Tim. And so we encourage people at parishes to do this as well. All right, so let me just tell you about Tim. Because we're in Baltimore and live in a very kind of Catholic part of Baltimore, we say that Tim grew up Catholic. He was probably confirmed in about 8th grade or so. And after he was confirmed, his mom stopped making him go and Tim stopped going to church. Tim is kind of around 35 to 45-year-old age. I used to be on the younger side of what Tim is. Now I'm on the older side of what Tim is. I'm almost out of that kind of definition. Again, Tim grew up Catholic. He's got a very stressful life. It's stressful because he has 3 kids driving to 3 different schools, 3 different directions. He's finding stress because he's got a ton of debt because he's living way, way, way beyond his means. His marriage, now that he's kind of 15, 20 years into the marriage, it's not going well. There's just, stress fractures in the marriage. And of course, on the weekend, Tim is not going to church. And if you asked Tim, why aren't you going to church? He would say, well, because it's boring and bad. That's been his experience of it. So on the weekend, what's Tim doing? If the Ravens are in town, he's going to the Ravens game. We're in a little bit more, semi-affluent area. He might be going to play golf on a Sunday morning, or he's just relaxing to enjoy some Tim time. But Tim is not going to church. What Tim knows about Catholicism is a muddled mess from what he thinks he remembers from those confirmation classes and what he learned from the Da Vinci Code. Right? This is Tim. And so we stay focused on Tim. We've defined Tim in those ways because it helps us to remember that that's who we're trying to reach. That's the person we want to stay focused upon. And in everything not everything we do, but in most environments we create, or where we're creating an environment for Tim, we want to remember that's the person we're trying to reach. And we want to create an experience that will draw Tim into a deeper faith. And defining Tim, what that does for us is it just helps us to create what I say is kind of a shortcut. So in our parish, if we're doing something or talking about a homily or message or communication, what would Tim think of that? Bless you. So it's so important for you, I would say, again, to define Tim and begin thinking, or whoever the person is in your community, Henry Hudson, that's kind of funny. Anyway, whoever is in your community that is the quintessential unchurched person. And so let me introduce you to one of our Timonium Tims. Check out this video. And hopefully the audio works. I didn't double check that. Shoot. Do we have it? Can we get any audio? I should have double checked that. Tell you what, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to see if I can go back to that. Let's go to this, and I'll see if I can play it after this. So take about 10 minutes at your table and ask these questions. Number one, what is one thing your parish should stop doing because it's not making disciples? Because it's maybe burning you out. All right, it's burning people out, and you know it doesn't make disciples, but you keep doing it, or it's something you got to do differently. Second, define your Tim. What are unchurched people doing on a Sunday morning instead of going to church? What reasons they give for why they don't want to go to church or why they left the church? So take some time for those discussion questions, and I'll see if I can figure that out. So you got about 10 minutes. All right, give yourselves 30 seconds, and then we'll, Steve. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Steve's coming back, so 3, 2, 1. All right, anyone, something you need to stop doing, or at least do much differently because it's not really making disciples? Pretend the bishop's not here. Do you really have one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I probably don't need a microphone.
No, you do.
They need to hear it.
Making donuts. We have a huge donut ministry where people coming in at 3 a.m. and we're questioning.
Making donuts,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of work to organize.
But we said we want the fellowship that it brings without making the donut that effort.
Okay, right. There you go. There's a good thing. Sometimes the purpose is good, right? We want fellowship. We want people connecting, but maybe making the donuts isn't the best way for connecting. Good. That's good. Others, things people want to stop doing. Other ones?
We need to stop assuming that we know their story and actually ask them what their story is.
Stop assuming we know people's story, meaning people not coming to church?
Right.
Oh, that's good. Good. Stop assuming we know why they're not coming.
Well, I'd say also people that are coming.
Same thing for why people are coming too. Okay. How about you guys for Tim? How would you describe your Tim? What is the reasons they don't go to church or why they stop going to church? No Tim.
Their kids are through faith formation.
All right. So they came because their kids were coming. Now their kids are done. Faith formation, probably confirmation or first communion. They stopped coming. Okay? Back there and then over here.
Their parents are gone.
Their parents aren't going. So
Elder-
kids don't come because the parents aren't going.
Elderly parents, they
Okay.
used to come whenever to bring them, and they are gone.
Okay. Father, over here.
They're overextended. There are too many activities on Sunday morning.
So incredibly busy. Don't have time to fit church in. A very busy schedule.
I'm sorry. I would say about overextended. Part of that is the opposite. Sundays are needed because they're overextended to rest.
All right. Because they're overextended, Sunday needs to be a time of rest. And then back here, maybe we'll do two more.
One of the reasons I think they don't go is because, and I don't know about other churches, and I know our church has changed, where for years, there was nothing for the youth.
Okay.
They came and they were told to shut up, and that was it.
Okay. So nothing for young people. And by youth, do you mean middle school, high school, or do you mean children?
I mean, children, middle school, all the way up through high school.
Okay. All that. Okay, that whole wide range. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll find definitely children are a big way, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, to encourage people back in the church. People do things for their kids they wouldn't do otherwise. We have one more in the back here.
Yeah, speaking a little bit more for the young adults, I went to college and lost my faith, so why would I come back?
Okay. So what made you lose your faith in college? What made you stop going in college?
Everything. Party culture, no reason to. My parents weren't there, so I didn't go.
Okay. So you were going for obligation when you lived at home. When the obligation was gone, so was your church attendance, right? So one of the things we have to kind of come to is that is a thing that obligation worked for a long time in our culture. That was why people would go to church. Obligation's gone. People don't feel obliged anymore. So if we're going to have people come back to church, it can't just be out of obligation, because those days are gone. They'll open the doors and they'll come because they're supposed to, are gone. So we just have to acknowledge that. I think there's some bad things about that. There's some good things about that it's gone. So let's see if I can get this to work, and let me introduce you to our Timonium Tim. Let's see. You want to put that there? Do they need it?
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Marsden with A View from the Pew, and joining us today is our Timonium Tim, who happens to have, not coincidentally probably, the same name, Tim Barger. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We've been talking about evangelization and Timonium Tim. It's sort of our, I guess, prototype, if you will, for our unchurched parishioner or future parishioner or semi-church, which I guess you were, right?
I was pretty much unchurched, I would say. Yeah, definitely grew up with not a lot of formal religion in my life.
When you heard some folks here at the Nativity talking about Timonium Tim, it kind of hit you like a lightning bolt.
Yeah,
right?
very much. I remember when Father White mentioned it the first time. And that was my wife and I were sitting in the first pew, and I looked up. I was like, he's talking about me. So it was really interesting to hear his perspective, and the whole theme of the Mass that day was around evangelism and how you can invite the unchurched into the parish. And it was just really interesting to kind of be there, probably my second or third time ever to the church, and kind of said my name, and then, like you said, it's the same, and ultimately was very, very powerful.
But here you were, I mean, you're a family guy, you've got kids, 3 kids.
3
right?
kids, correct?
But for a while, I guess it was your wife's thing, right?
Oh, very much, yeah. So it was her thing, and she'd take the kids from time to time and do that, but it was definitely perfect.
When you first came here, and I know some people feel intimidated when they come to church and haven't been to church, whether it's out of a sense of not knowing what to expect, or maybe a slight sense of guilt, or feeling out of place. Did you ever feel that way, or was it an immediate sense of, think I could belong
Well, I think I felt that way growing up, being at times where I would go with friends in their church or something and never knowing what to do and why they're standing up or not. And, the first few times, you just naturally have that kind of watching and looking around to see what's going on. But, for the minute I walked in, very welcoming, it was very inviting. And the fact that I wasn't Catholic at the time and was able to come and sit down and feel very comfortable, and everybody, and it came up in multiple messages, around how it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or not. It's being welcoming and being a parish about welcoming and inviting people in, and that's been true to me. I mean, it made me feel very, very comfortable.
What was more important to you in the beginning, finding a church where you could worship or also finding a religion?
I think it was more the spiritual piece of it, and really trying to understand the importance and seeing how important it was for my wife. I think that was the piece that was as intriguing as anything, is understanding what it did for her to kind of get her to a place where she, felt great. And for us to go through that together now has been tremendous.
Yeah, I want to talk about how it was for the two of you and your family, but also for just you.
Okay.
How did it make you feel? And was it sort of this sense of realization, and then did it have a sort of snowball effect where you just got deeper and deeper?
Yeah, I mean, I growing up, always had questions about, I guess, the technical religion, and wasn't sure what I was aligned with or not. So for me personally, it was very much about just finding a place to think and have some quiet time and understand and learn over the last year and a half how to pray and have a conversation with God and be able to quietly listen. And there's been multiple examples of times where, it has really come to fruition that day. Every morning try to read a daily devotional just to kind of get the day started, and it's a good way for us to start to get the day together and do that. And time again, there's been a message that's helped us through that day. It's been tremendous.
Wow, so that really says it's life-changing.
Oh, very much. Yeah, very much. We do it every day religiously, and if I'm traveling or she's traveling, we have it on our phones and we'll send it to the other, so it's been great.
I'm wondering if you ran into any obstacles, whether from friends or family members who, are seeing a new Tim?
I don't know, probably questions, more than obstacles. I don't know that anybody, can't think of one example of times where there was anybody that I didn't feel was supportive of it. Some unknown, I would say to my family members, my brothers and parents, that just didn't have that formal upbringing either. So I think they're probably questioning, but to use the term that Father White has given us, invest and invite, sooner or later, I'm hoping to, invite them in and see how they like it. Yeah,
what does the word evangelist mean to you?
I think growing up that word was maybe intimidating to me, whereas when I changed it to invest and invite, to me it makes sense. And that's one of the things that here has been very powerful to me, is being able to put things in what I consider to be my language and making it a lot more comfortable and being able to say, yeah, why don't you come? Kind of check it out and see what it's all about. It was very helpful to me, and I was always worried about it, the other end of evangelism, taking it too far. And I think that can happen, and that was actually one of the messages that Father White, again, in one of the earlier times I heard him talk about is, you can take it too far. There's got to be that time where it's got to be a comfortable thing, and that's what really been beneficial to me, to feel like I am evangelizing for the church without that discomfort of feeling like it's going too far. So,
Well, I'll tell you what is powerful is you sharing your story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that is a view from the pew. Tim Barger, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So a couple things I just want to say. First of all, Tim was a total guy that would never come to church. So his wife Chris, we mentioned in there, she was on our volunteer team, and she volunteered a few times. I'll ask her, hey, will Tim ever come to, what about Tim? She's like, no, he says he's never coming. This is my thing. He totally, he's happy with me being a part of this community and knows it's good for me, but he has no interest whatsoever. And then a kind of crisis hit their family. And because we created this community and welcome community, Tim was welcomed into it when that crisis hit. It was kind of an opportune time. And that is a lot of times the way it is for people, right? It's until that crisis comes, they might not get involved and go back to church, but it's creating that environment so when they do come, as Tim talked about, he felt welcome. he mentioned something else in there that I didn't talk about, and might as well take this moment to do that. We talk about our strategy for reaching people is that simple. We say invest and invite. So people often say, how do you get people coming back to church? That we say we ask the people in our pews to invest in friends, family members, coworkers who don't have a relationship with Christ in his church, who aren't going to church, and to just invest in them the way you would invest in any friendship, invest, relationally, invest prayerfully, maybe even fast for them, invest in them, and when appropriate, invite them to come join us. It's that kind of simple for our strategy for how we are going to reach Tim. Just a couple of thoughts when it comes to the unchurched, and I'll move on to the next part, is that we need to begin to act as if they're there. That when we come, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but we act as we begin talking to people as if they're there, even when they're not. So one of the things we'll say each week, we do a thing called end notes, which is after communion, before the closing, the blessing, the final blessing and closing song. Myself or another staff member, usually two of us get up and we recap the homily. Here's what the homily was about this week. If there's an action step, what you're supposed to do, maybe sign up for something, we tell them that. But before we do any of that, we just say, look, if this is your first time in church in a long time, if you don't consider yourself a church person, a religious person, we are so glad you are here. We're trying to act like that every single week. Or even sometimes I'll say, if you only here because somebody promised to buy you brunch if you came, and I'm telling the people in the pews, hey, offer people food, offer people food if they come. So we act as if they're there. And we try to do everything as acting as if the unchurched person is there with us. All right, so we're going to move on to the next one. But I'll tell you what, we were going to do a break, but just stand up a minute. Just stand up in your place. You guys have been sitting for a long time. Stand up. If you need to stretch out, roll your shoulders if you want, whatever you do. They say when you're getting tired, just hitting your hands or doing something like that. I'm trying to learn guitar. It's amazing how that'll wake me up. So just take a 30-second stretch.
Can we ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
I noticed you said this was the view from the pew.
Yep.
And when do you share those snippets and how often?
Okay. That was actually a TV show we put together. We recorded about 2 or 3 years ago. So part of the segment was a view from the pew. You can watch those on Catholic TV. They're on at all different times.
But did you create them for your parish?
We created them ourselves. We had somebody on staff that we paid to do that. So.
On time, so not continuously?
No, we did it out of the block of chunk. All right, grab a seat. We'll go back. We'll go move on. And if you have to use the restroom, we lost a few people using the restroom.